For my oral history project, I interviewed my grandma, Tata Bartles, and she was able to discuss with me during our interview about what it's like to be growing up in an occupied country and the limits in food you have and the limits in basically everything you have when your country goes through a war and um, just what it's like. And a point to bring up before I introduce the interview, a big point in the post World War II life that's hard to understand in Germany was that the Red Cross in Germany, which is normally a big aid and relief agency post war, could not really be helpful to the people because they've been so thoroughly taken over by the Nazi Party during the war that they had no credibility of any source post the war. And the head of the Red Cross during the war did awful things. So the post war, there was just no system for organized relief in the country that could be trusted by the Allied sources. And my grandparents were very lucky because they grew up outside major city centers and they had land that they could farm. So that's just a piece I wanted to point out. And so here's the interview.
Of course, when the country has been besieged, there's nothing. The men were all at the front.
After World War II, food production per capita in 1947 was only 51% of its level in 1938, and the official food rations set by the occupying powers vary between 1,040 and 1,550 calories per day. My grandma was able to tell me more about how the average German family was able to get food.
So what I remember in food, my grandma was home, and she, they're old hands in cooking. She did lots of potatoes. We did not have butter and oil, so she used coffee. She used coffee to fry potatoes. So on the property we had berries and apples, what grew in that time. But my mom grew tobacco because she was a smoker. So all the tobacco was hanging to dry up in the attic. So what I'm remembering is that, of course, there was nothing. There was no meat, maybe broth, and we had what we could, get in the store, fish and something. But what I remember really well after the war, I had never had a banana. And after the war, all of a sudden, bananas came in. They must have been shipped from somewhere.
Wow.
And also cornbread. We had in school, like you in the cafeteria food, we had cornbread, but not the nice sweet cornbread now. It was just more like a bread. It's very hard and everything. So that's...
Did the actual war, after the war, did that still disrupt your school and going to school and being able to learn all this?
No. I was very young when the war was going on, and when it finished, I was 8, and I lost my father. In the war, I was like a 9 years old, and I don't remember school stopping. It was just very limited. We had no paper to write on, this kind of thing. All the supplies were not there.
After the war, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones, each administered separately by the USA, the USSR, France, and Britain. I talked to my grandma about what zone she was in and the refugees they took in.
During the occupation, when the war was over, we were in the English zone. There were 4 zones, and Berlin, the main city, was divided into 4 zones. The Russians, the French, English, Americans. We were in the English zone.
A whole generation of German youth grew up with tanks and armies on their lawns often. So my grandma talked about what that was like.
Went to the Autobahn, and here the English army coming in with jeeps and panzers and jeeps, and that's the first time I saw a black person.
Did you guys use coal as an energy source, and how was the heating?
We had a coal oven in the basement.
Okay.
We did coals, and then it's like called central heating with these apparatus which are in every room, you haven't seen that before. And you had to go in there and shovel the coal, so...
We as Americans don't know what it is like to have war on our own soil ever since the Civil War. So my grandma described what it was like to grow up in the aftermath of a bombed out city.
Our Braunschweig was also, destroyed, but not like Berlin.
Okay.
And it was built back. And then Dresden is another town. The beautiful cathedral was totally destroyed. When the war was over, or during the war, the Russian zone, I have a lot of relatives in the eastern zone in East Prussia, which is now half Poland or something after the war. All these relatives came to my mom, to our house, and we had like 40 people living in this house with 1.5 bathrooms. The next one is there were no supplies, of course, after the war. There was no factory work and everything. So there was no paper, there was nothing. So no toilet paper.
Wow.
So this is my joke, Nicholas. We used newspapers. Okay, instead of toilet paper. We cut up newspapers into little squares. And this is my little joke. Can you imagine when you use newspapers, how your behind looks?
Wars are always going on, and yet we often don't think about what goes on in a country after a war when the losers must rebuild. Talking to my grandmother about growing up in an occupied country gave me a new insight into what is going on today in many places around the world. I gained a deeper respect for my grandmother and her mother for enduring such harsh circumstances. As Neville Chamberlain once said, "In war, whichever side may call itself victor, there are no winners but all are losers."